good a nice refresher to hear that presentation. As much time as I spend in the Capitol, you forget things. So yeah. Alrighty, well, I'll just start and people can trickle in. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today. Day 5, I think, of our institute. And yeah, I hope y'all are learning a lot. So yeah, again, yeah, welcome today. Thank you all for joining us on this really sunny Sunday afternoon. Well, it's sunny in Missoula. It's where I'm at right now. But yeah, thank you for joining us for our workshop today. This next workshop, we will be going over local organizing, or local elections and municipal organizing, which is, like Howell said, really important. You know, local politics really impact a lot of our day-to-day. And I think that gets kind of missed sometimes, you know, in election season. You know, you have all these, the federal, state, and then, you know, like local elections kind of get pushed aside, but they are really important. They really do affect, they affect us. So yeah, with all that being said, we just really hope that the information shared today will help inform your efforts in your own communities, and we look forward to staying connected with you all. Yeah, so I'm gonna go over some housekeeping things. I know many of you have probably heard this over and over, but just in case there's some people that missed it, just gonna go over it again. Today's event is meeting style, so meaning you can unmute yourself by clicking the microphone icon at the bottom left corner of your screen, or if you're using the phone, you can unmute yourself by pressing 6. Yeah, we really encourage questions, so you could use the chat function or else the Slack workspace. Staff will be checking either, so really encourage you all to you know, use those as you want. You also have the option to turn on your captions, and to do that, you could just click the little arrow, the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And yeah, if any kind of technical difficulties arise during this session, feel free to give our staff a call at 406-317-1505. And one of our staff will drop that number in the chat. Yeah, and then at the end of this workshop, we really encourage you to fill out our evaluation form. Like Howell said, it really helps us improve our program as well, you know, make it more accessible and just overall just better for everyone. So yeah, if you could do that, you'll be entered in to win a book by our keynote speaker, What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat, or else a Visa gift card. Both exciting prizes. I mean, I love a Visa gift card. But yeah, so kind of went over all that. And so now I am going to hand it over to Ella, who is going to kind of do the bulk of this workshop. And I don't think I need to introduce Ella. You all probably read their bio. You know, they're a Libra, so that's a fun fact about them. But anyways, I will shut up now and I will pass it to Ella. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Danny. We're going to cover a lot of information today, and there is a lot of opportunity at the local level to affect change. And there's a lot of important work that happens in local government by people who oftentimes we may not even know their names. So one of the things that I would like to encourage you all to do today is to put questions in the chat, and I am going to rely pretty heavily on you, Danny, to interrupt me. You sort of know the slides a little bit, so if you feel like there are questions, I have a little trouble seeing the chat with the slideshow up, so I'd love to stop, and talk about some of these positions and issues as we're going. And then Danny, if there are questions that might belong later for the Q&A, hopefully you'll be able to help me sort that out. So make liberal use of the chat, and we'll get right into some of these important issues. I'll start off by telling you my name, Ella, and my pronouns are she or they, and I'm the program director for Montana Women Vote. So I want to start off today by talking about the county commission, city council, the mayor, and school board. So these are all sort of county, city level, school district level positions, and all very important positions in the community, in all of our communities. So a county commission typically in Montana is made up of 3 commissioners, all occupying 6-year terms. So they're elected every 6 years, and there are no term limits for county commissioners in Montana. The county commission forms county policies in areas such as subdivisions. So if there's a subdivision that's outside city limits, the county will regulate the policies for that. They make zoning decisions outside of city limits. So the county commission can provide support to community services that support low-income women and families. They can make zoning decisions that either promote or prevent the development of low-income housing. So a county commission is a very invisible decision, mostly because their power lies primarily outside of the cities. But they really do have those crucial decision-making powers in terms of zoning and subdivisions and things like water. So if you're getting involved with anything that might be outside of city limits, the county commission is probably where you're going to be getting involved. Next, I'll talk a little bit about the city council, which creates city policies and ordinances. The makeup and amount of city council members or city commission members, it varies by cities. In Montana, a lot of our cities have made their own decisions in terms of how they want to structure their council or commission, or what they want to call it. So not only do we not necessarily have a consistent structure for every city in terms of how many commissioners and how they're elected, but we also don't necessarily know from city to city whether it's called a city council or a city commission. So your city may have a council, it may have a commission, and you may be electing one city council member for your ward or your district, or you may be electing a slate of city council members that are voted on citywide. So it really can depend in Montana, but they're all looking at that 4-year term. And they create city policies, aka ordinances and resolutions. And we'll talk a little bit more about what ordinances and resolutions are later. They also set city taxes and manage the city budget and work with the mayor to create the strategic plan for the city. So really similarly to county commissioners, they can provide financial support to community services supporting low-income folks in the community, and they can be involved in zoning decisions that promote or prevent the development of low-income housing. The thing that's different between the county and the city is that the city is actually able to provide financial support to programs, create new programs, and fund them through the city budget, and pay for them by obviously levying taxes on the city. So they do have that ability. Oh, I did want to mention just a brief example. And if there are any other examples of abilities of the city council that you want to pop in the chat, I mentioned earlier that we'll talk a little bit more about ordinances and resolutions later. But one example of some city commission organizing that has happened recently is implementing Indigenous Peoples Day in various communities across the state, and removing Columbus Day and replacing it with Indigenous Peoples Day in that community. That's a bill that often fails at the state level. So if you were here for the last awesome session that Howell and Hannah talked through, sometimes you don't get a bill through at the legislature, and sometimes you bring it by every year and every year. And then maybe your strategy pivot from there is to go to the city. And if you get enough Indigenous People Days passed across the state of Montana, that is a really valuable bargaining chip to go then back to the legislature and say, Havre did this, Missoula did this, Helena did this, Billings did this, all these cities did this. Why are you still saying no? And that can be a very compelling argument. And we will talk a little bit more about methods for affecting change like that towards the end. So what is a mayor and what are the responsibilities of a mayor? So a mayor, a city councilor or city commissioner, is serving a 4-year term. The mayor oversees all city departments. They also develop the city's yearly strategic plan with the city council or city commission and the city staff. They are in charge of securing resources to meet the goals of the city. So they make that strategic plan, and then they have to meet those goals in the strategic plan with resources that they are in charge of securing. They're also the figurehead for the city. They can market a city, they can travel, they can argue for spending money in the city budget to advertise for people to come visit the city, et cetera, et cetera. And another important responsibility of the mayor is to veto and break ties. So frequently mayors do have the ability to veto city council, things passed by the city council or commission. Often the council or commission can override that veto with a certain percentage. So if the mayor vetoes something and the commission comes back unanimously and says, no, we're going to do this anyways, then that veto is overridden. And the mayor often frequently will break tie votes in the city council or city commission. There's a couple cities in Montana that have an even number of commissioners and the mayor votes every time. But that is only, I think only Great Falls, but I could be wrong about that. So the mayor does serve as the primary representative with other cities and government agencies, as I mentioned before. So it's not just about marketing. There could be negotiations, or if there's a crisis going on in a particular community, the mayor can serve an important role. And the mayor can also provide leadership to promote diversity and inclusion of all residents in our communities, either by the things that they say or how they're conducting the strategic plan, how they're prioritizing certain things, how they're running those city departments and directing city departments to operate, etc. And one more before I stop for a couple of questions is the school board. So the school board is responsible for hiring and or firing the school superintendent for that school district. They do serve 3-year terms, which is quite confusing. It means that you're sometimes voting for school board on a year that you're not voting for anything else, which means those elections frequently see, frankly, abysmal turnout because there's nobody else to vote for and people may not have any idea what's going on at the school board level, especially if you don't have children. So yes, they hire and fire the school superintendent. They set the school's yearly budget. They approve contractors or contracts for teachers and outside vendors. and they expand the district or close schools when there are sort of big efforts being happened or being pushed for shifts in a certain school district. So I do really want to reinforce that school board, both running for school board and getting involved and active at the school board, is not just important for people with kids and people who go to schools. As you can see, they have a lot of power over who's getting contracts and what is going on with the districts and certain buildings. And school boards have power that affect a lot of issues in the community in terms of transportation and how far students and teachers and everyone in the community is having to travel for certain things, and a lot of city funding issues. So school boards are hugely important. And one of the things that I talk about a lot, it's sort of like I don't know, it's something that I'm really passionate about, but doesn't come up very often, is trying to talk to people who don't have kids about running for school board, and representing people in the community without children in those sorts of spaces, and making sure that we're advocating for certain things at that level. So that's a little bit about the school board. Before we go on to talk about a couple additional elected officials more in the legal realm, I want to go ahead and pause and see if, Danny, we have any questions or thoughts coming up in the chat. Yes, there is a great point. Some awesome points in the chat about how legislators at the state level will use, oh, it's the city's job, we want to let the cities do this, as an excuse to not pass policies at the state or to ignore certain issues. So it really is a good opportunity to be talking about those issues at the local level. And then especially if those cities can go back and say, we actually do think that this is a state level issue. We passed this policy at the city level and we're still having some issues. And we think that it's really important for the state to take a strong stance on this. And sometimes city commissioners can go to the state and make a strong argument in that regard. Obviously, COVID, everything going on with COVID, school boards are becoming a flashpoint for everything from what's going on with our community health and can we protect not just our kids, but our whole communities? And do we have the tools to be able to protect ourselves? But also, what are we learning in our society? And what are we saying is okay to learn and not to learn? And are we now moving into a space where we don't trust people with information and we don't trust children to learn things and have access to all sorts of different information and form their own opinions? So all these sorts of issues are becoming huge, huge flashpoints at the school district level. Also, yes, diversity, equity, and inclusion, sort of similarly, it's not just about banned books and banned content, but all sorts of issues around equity in schools. And Mindy, we will be talking about sheriff in just a minute, actually. So I'm going to go ahead and move us on, but I will pause again in a few minutes to keep checking in the chat. And we'll have some opportunity later for folks if you want to come off mute and have some discussion, ask questions, etc. So now that we've talked a little bit about county commission, city commission, mayor, and school district, I want to move into the sort of legal realm, talk a little bit about district court judges, county attorneys, sheriffs, and coroners. So I'm going to start off with a district court judge, which in counties across Montana occupy 6-year terms. And district court judges preside over all felony cases, all probate cases, all naturalization proceedings, and most civil cases. So these district court judges, what that basically means, these are the folks who are making the decisions about all of the general day-to-day arrests that are happening in most of our most of our communities. So these people have a tremendous amount of power. These folks are making a massive amount of decisions about people's lives, people's ability to continue in their employment, people's ability to continue living their lives in the ways that they're used to. And obviously, there are a lot of issues that can arise with district court judges in terms of racial bias and different sorts of prejudice, anti-trans feelings, anti-poor sentiments. The criminalization of poverty is rampant in district courthouses. So district court judges are massively important, and frequently we at Montana Women Vote. Wow, Montana Women Goat would be awesome. So we should make that a Slack channel and send a bunch of goat memes. Anyway, Montana Women Vote frequently gets a lot of questions about who to vote for district court judge. So doing your research around who's running for district court judge, as well as maybe getting involved in a campaign for district court judge in your local community, is hugely important in terms of what sorts of outcomes we're having, who's getting arrested, what kind of terms are they getting sentenced to. Are people who don't belong in jail going there because this judge is frankly an asshole? You know, those sorts of things. And then just a little note about the district court clerk. The clerk keeps the records and sets the schedules for the court. They act as the jury commissioner. They receive and disperse child support, maintenance, and other trust accounts, and they issue and record marriage licenses. So the district court clerk is sometimes also an elected official, and they are keeping track of everything, paying those payments that need to go out, keeping track of things like child support, and doing all of those sort of day-to-day accounting things. And you can imagine that having a certain level of racial bias or any sort of prejudice, internal prejudice, that is measurable in an external way would be hugely problematic for a district clerk. So if you live in a county where your clerk is elected, asking them questions around racial outcomes and things like that might be a great idea if you have that opportunity to do some sort of candidate forum or something like that. County attorneys.
Before you move on, Terry Joe asked a really good question about finding more information on candidates for district court judges.
That is a great question. In terms of research, I will say that as far as organizations go, it has been difficult for us as a collective body of organizations who work in coalition and individual organizations to put up good and comprehensive information for every county on these sorts of issues. We do try really hard to communicate with folks in the communities that we're most active about court judges, but my best recommendation for you would be to look at your local paper. Typically, your local newspaper will do some sort of Q&A or some sort of blurbs about the local candidates that are running. If you don't have a local paper, or you do not believe that your local paper probably is going to do something like this, I would highly recommend that you get together with a couple of people in your community. You get in touch with someone like Montana Women Vote, and you put together a couple of questions that you want to send to all of the candidates, and you can make them really vague. So you can send them to judicial candidates, you can send them to attorney candidates, you can send them to clerk candidates, and you can send them to sheriff candidates. You can make them very vague, and publish them on your social media, online, email them to the candidates, and try to get the candidates to respond. And then you can sort of share those answers. That's the best way to do it if your local paper isn't doing some sort of forum or Q&A. And then the other thing is that frequently organizations like the League of Women Voters or your local Democratic or Republican committees will sponsor debates or forums or at least Q&As. So looking at your local political parties for information as well. I really do wish that I had a better answer for this question, and Montana Women Vote really hopes to improve the amount that we're able to talk about these races in the future. I just can't promise you that we're going to be able to have information every election on every race in the state. And it is quite a challenge. It's a challenge for all of us. So that's a great question.
Yeah, I'll just add like one more thing. Sometimes, not all the time, but some of the candidates will have like some kind of social media platform, whether it's like Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. I don't know what that is. But anyways, that's also that also might be serve as like a resource. But yeah, like Ella said, it's really hard to get that information because yeah, it's just not there. But yeah. Did you see the question in the chat? Does Ballotpedia cover local?
Sometimes Ballotpedia does cover local races. I've been able to find scattered information, but if it's a new candidate running for something like county attorney who's never held elected office before, sometimes they won't have a page. So it can sort of depend with places like Montana and those super local. But if they've held any sort of like public position in the past, usually it'll be listed on there. Awesome. These are super great questions. Thank you so much, everybody. So now let's talk a little bit about the county attorney. The county attorney, this one is huge because while the judge makes all the decisions, the county attorney has a lot of discretion in terms of who they're prosecuting, what sorts of sentences they're asking for, what sorts of legal arguments they're making, and how they're implementing the law in terms of all of those things I just listed. So they hold 4-year terms as well. They are the chief legal officer for a county as well as the public prosecutor. And what that means is that they oversee prosecution for all felonies in a county and some misdemeanor crimes. They frequently have an office that they hire themselves with some, deputy county attorneys and other lawyers who may also be doing some of the legal arguments, but they, at the end of the day, are shaping the vision of the county attorney's office, and they are sort of having that general oversight over what sort of prosecutorial strategy the office is going to pursue. So they handle all general civil litigation matters for a county. That can be land use, unemployment or employment issues, property tax issues, election issues, and contract issues, contract disputes. They also enforce zoning and building code violations. They serve as the legal advisor to many local health boards and as well as the county commission or city council. So the county attorney is as well as that district court judge, a very important position, and also a position that sort of exact same conversation that we just had about how it's nearly impossible to find information. And these people are almost always prosecuting people, in an overly punitive way. And the criminalization of poverty plays out a lot in county attorneys' offices, as well as those district court judges. I promise this is a stock photo of a sheriff that I got from Google. I don't know what sheriff this is, but now I want to talk a little bit about sheriffs. And as you all might imagine, sheriffs are huge in Montana. It's impossible to talk about sheriffs and coroners without talking about the missing and murdered Indigenous women and people crisis in Montana and other states, but especially here, there's a huge issue with missing and murdered people and how many law enforcement offices will pass the buck between each other and say that isn't my responsibility, or and any other number of issues. So sheriffs are frequently problematic, and unseating sheriffs and getting involved with sheriffs races is quite difficult, but I do want to talk just a little bit about the specific responsibilities of a sheriff. So they're charged by, in Montana code, in our state law, with two things really. They're responsible for law enforcement on a county level. So they're basically the police chief of the county. And in a rural state like Montana, the sheriff is huge. And they're tasked with ensuring that all local, state, and federal laws are followed. So that is what a sheriff is supposed to do. And how that plays out, as you can imagine, is very sporadic and frequently problematic. So we all know many of the issues that can arise with law enforcement. Sheriffs are not immune to those. Sheriffs aren't members of the police union, so they do have the ability to sort of speak publicly without having to be cleared through their union most of the time. So frequently sheriffs are the ones where you'll see quoted in the news. And in Montana, there have been a lot of issues with sheriffs over the years, not investigating certain crimes or labeling certain crimes as labeling crimes incorrectly, shall we say, or labeling something as a certain crime without providing the public with the proof. So sheriffs can be hugely problematic for so many reasons. And I would highly recommend getting in touch with Montana Women Vote or other people in your community about getting involved with organizing around law enforcement and sort of how we might work together to change some of these elected officials in Montana who are really having horrible outcomes for lots of people across the state. Speaking of sheriffs, as you'll see at the bottom of this slide, frequently sheriffs are also the coroner in a county. So what is a coroner? A coroner is the one that inquires into the cause, manner, and circumstances of all human deaths in a county. So they are the person who's going to say, this was the cause of death for this deceased person. They establish the identity of all deceased persons, and they preserve evidence involving any human death. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of this slide, in many, maybe all counties in Montana, the sheriff and coroner are the same person, and there is basically no publicly available information on why this is, where this is the case, where it's not the case. It's hugely problematic, as you can imagine. It's really easy for a sheriff to say, I don't feel like investigating this death. I'm going to deem it a suicide, for example. And that sort of lack of accountability for that person being both the sheriff and the coroner it creates a lot of issues, and it creates a lot of miscategorization of crime, where we're punishing the wrong people too much for crimes that they either didn't commit or aren't violent, and we are not investigating these same communities that are being over-policed. We are actually just not investigating or classifying crimes being committed against them correctly because it's too hard, or we don't care about their communities, or basically our sheriffs and coroners are racist individuals. So this happens a ton in Montana, in the nation, and it's a huge issue. And it's one of the reasons why we've started really trying to talk to folks across the state about local politics and these positions of power in our communities.
Hey, Ella, is our sheriffs in charge of county jails?
Yes. Yes. So the sheriff is the countywide law enforcement officer. So the county jail would be at the sheriff's discretion. I'm not sure if there are any particularities with any city facilities, but I think all of our jails in Montana are county jails. So Danny, were there other, this is another good pausing place. Were there other questions that I missed?
I don't think a question. Okay, yeah. What qualifies to run must they have law enforcement background?
This is a great question. There is a really active group of volunteers in Billings that is interested in talking about some of these issues and maybe recruiting some folks to run for sheriff. You do not have to come from a law enforcement background necessarily to run for sheriff. There's actually weirdly no, like almost no real legal specifications that you like have to qualify. I will say that it is pretty rare, just to be totally honest with you all about the will of Montana voters as where we're currently sitting. It's pretty rare that you're gonna get someone who doesn't have some sort of law enforcement background running for sheriff against somebody who does. That is a very difficult election to argue. So you would have to have, if you were going to run for sheriff, you would have to have a really strong argument, community-based argument in your community to sort of argue why you should and why you are qualified to run the county's law enforcement if you don't have that background, if that makes sense. Thanks for that question, Donna. That is a good question.
Oh, that was Hannah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, this is not really a question, but someone just mentioned that a few years ago, the Montana sheriff signed on to a national declaration declaring sheriffs the ultimate authority in a county. Fun times.
Sweet.
Oh.
We love it. That's so annoying.
Yeah.
So yes, sheriffs and coroners, aka the same guy most of the time. Lots of issues there. Okay, so now that we've sort of talked about all of these different elected officials, what they do, what their responsibilities are, etc. Let's talk a little bit about now what? How do I change policies in my local community now that I know who all these people are and what they do? So I want to talk about a couple tools for organizing for policy change in your local community. As I mentioned earlier, you have some opportunities for things like ordinances and resolutions by the city council and commission and mayor. And then there's also some options for public pressure in your community through things like media and organizing. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about all of these things, and then we'll stop for about the last 10 minutes to sort of just talk about questions and brainstorm ideas in our local communities that you all might want to bring up. So let's start off with an ordinance versus a resolution. Ordinances and resolutions are both options for things that can be passed by a city commission or city council that you can lobby for in your local community. You don't really need to know much other than figure out who your city council person is and get in touch with them and say, I want to propose an ordinance or a resolution about this thing. You can also talk to an organization if you want to know a little bit more than that. But let's talk a little bit about the difference. An ordinance is a municipal law that often imposes a sanction for violation of that law. City ordinances do have to be they have to be legal under the parameters of laws of larger governments. So you can't pass a city ordinance that's illegal at the state level or inconsistent with federal law, for example. But as long as it checks out with federal law and state law, you can pass whatever city law you want if you get the votes, and if you have the funding for it. So a resolution, on the other hand, does not really have those sanctions or let's see what's in the example of a carrot and a stick, the stick side of it. So a resolution is a formal expression of the opinion or will of an official municipal body. So your city council or city commission, when they pass a resolution, they basically say, this is what we think, but it doesn't have an enforcement mechanism. So a resolution is, it can be helpful and powerful in a narrative way, but it is not sort of legally binding in that way. It is a narrative option, whereas a city ordinance is a legal enforceable option. Some examples of a city ordinance would be a non-discrimination ordinance. A lot of folks here in this Zoom room, a lot of folks at Montana Women Vote and other organizations have worked together over the years to pass and expand non-discrimination ordinances in many cities across Montana: Missoula, Helena, Bozeman. I believe Great Falls has passed a resolution, and I'm sure that there are others that I'm missing. And what a non-discrimination ordinance does is it means that within the city bounds, it is illegal to fire or deny someone housing for being LGBTQ, trans, non-binary, two-spirit, if that language is written correctly in those non-discrimination ordinances. So that's a good example of an ordinance. If there are other ordinances that folks have either worked on or heard of in your community, it would be awesome to be popping those into the chat, or resolutions. I know that Missoula passed a resolution that they wanted to be carbon neutral by a certain year, which I do not remember off the top of my head. I think that they went for a resolution because they wanted to put a strong statement forward that they were committed to climate goals, but also it was not politically popular to sort of legally bind themselves to meeting that carbon neutral. And maybe they did not have the ability to sort of enforce that when there's a lot of effects right outside the city lines, you know? I'm not seeing other examples in the chat, but if you think of other examples of ordinances and resolutions, please pop them in. I will say that the best way to start the process for passing an ordinance or a resolution is to have meetings with a friendly city council person. So find somebody on the city council or the mayor or in the city office who can talk to you about this issue, about the language, about what it might look like. And or get in touch with an organization or another city that has passed the policy that you want to pass and get a hold of their language. Because if you have language from another ordinance or resolution, it's super easy to just change to, you know, edit the city and edit a couple of other things, and pass it through your own city. Missoula resolved to be carbon neutral by 2025. Thank you so much, Destiny. Appreciate that. I could not remember the year off the top of my head. And as Destiny and DV taught me yesterday in our session, which you can watch on YouTube, about sharing your story through independent journalism, you have to have your facts right. And if you don't, just say that you don't know. So now that we've talked a little bit about ordinances and resolutions, it's awesome to pass a binding policy or pass a resolution through the city commission. It can feel super exciting and like you just absolutely achieved something and got something done in your community, but that's not always possible. Some of us live in super, you know, counties or cities that are antithetical to our values, shall we say. And so it's not possible for us to pass the policies that we want through our city commission or council. So let's talk a little bit about public pressure. The last thing that I will talk about in terms of getting some things done at your local level is to do a public pressure campaign. You can hold actions. So people power, that looks like rallies, that looks like creative actions around town to sort of display your point. An example that I've heard of from Flint is doing all sorts of creative actions, including water and glasses of water around the city to sort of illustrate their specific point. So you can use things like physical objects to represent larger numbers. You can hold rallies, you can do art, you can partner with local artists to do sort of art and activism. So I would encourage you with your local actions, especially if you're in smaller communities, to be as creative as possible. If you don't have a lot of people and you don't think you can pull off a big rally that will, really catch people's attention, then you might want to think about some other way to get artistic or get creative or provide some visuals that will really drive the point home for people. The next way to exert public pressure is what we call in organizing, quote, earned media. So earned media is basically any media that you get that's free. So posting on your social media, asking other people to share that, writing a letter to the editor, getting a news story, getting quoted in a news story, pitching a local reporter and saying, hey, this is a huge issue in our community. My group is organizing it. I really think that this deserves a story, and I'll give you some quotes for your story. I really think that you should write about this. You can always get in touch with a reporter and try to pitch them a story. You never know if they're going to do it, but if you pitch well enough, you frequently can get something going. They often will quote someone who disagrees with you about that thing, so that's always something to be aware of. But yes, earned media is any sort of media or public social attention that's broader than your own one-on-one interactions that you can get that's free. So outside of social media posts, letters to the editor, getting quoted in your local news, if there are other examples of earned media that folks can think of, it would be awesome for you to pop them in the chat. And then your last option for public pressure is what's called, quote, paid media, which means you're spending money on it. So this is everything from Facebook ads to advertisements in the newspaper to big printings of flyers that you're putting up all around town to, maybe you're buying a commercial on your local airwaves, or maybe you are paying for a short radio spot that you're going to call Ella at Montana Women Vote to write a jingle for you because it's my hobby, writing jingles for people, and nobody ever asks me to do it. I will do it for free and put it on the radio, or running an ad basically anywhere that you can run an ad. You can do those little digital ads that play on apps for people in the local community. You can get really localized with all sorts of paid media these days. So those are your main options for public pressure in your local community. And then once you do that public pressure campaign, frequently you can go back to the ordinance or resolution and go back to those city council members. Watch out for what city council members are saying in the press about all of your public pressure that you're drumming up. And hopefully somebody eventually will say, you know what, I changed my mind on this issue. The community seems to really care. And then you got your person to propose that ordinance and you're ready to roll for local policy change. So this is the first time that I've done this full presentation on Zoom. So hopefully it went well. And I would love to hear a little bit from folks in the room if you have any final lingering questions, or if there are sort of issues or community pressures that you're experiencing in your community that you want to sort of brainstorm what, what your local policy options might be. In the chat, or you can unmute.
Hi, how are you? I'm Terry Joe Rask.
Hi.
I'm interested in I was just wondering if there's any sort of policy initiatives on domestic abuse, or is there anything that we can move forward on helping DV victims? I know it's really weighted.
It is, it can be weighted, but it's a very good question and a super important issue. I'll start off by definitely recommending the Montana Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. Not only do they advocate at the state level, but they have a lot of local groups and local communities that are mostly organized around, I think, direct support, but they also do get involved in some advocacy at times. But I also think that passing an ordinance or resolution at your local level on domestic and sexual violence prevention is definitely possible. I think one example that I could come up with off the top of my head would actually be a proactive idea, and that would be advocating at your city council and your mayor level for budgetary increases towards response teams and groups that are organized to actually provide services for survivors rather than law enforcement. I think increasing funding is probably the number one thing that we could do for violence prevention.
I agree, and also prevention, which is that increasing funding is prevention, because if people have a place to live or money to leave, they're more likely to leave if there's a support system. But also, like, I don't know. I was just wondering if there was anything on the side of like laws, because I know that a lot of women try to leave or they call the police and then like nothing's actually done from the police side, and it makes it worse. And I was wondering if there's any laws or like, I don't know, any suggestions to talk to city council about things of that nature. Like, what can we do on a systemic level to kind of prevent like the cycle of like the tragedy of like when women leave, versus like, I know funding's great, but there's also that the police don't do anything.
Totally.
And that also is like electing better sheriffs and people who will support that and recognize domestic abuse where it lies and the severity of it.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right about that. It's a huge issue that touches not just the budget, but policing and community services. But I would love for others, if you have heard of any local policies to address domestic and sexual violence, to pop examples in the chat. And otherwise, Terry Jo, I will do a little looking in about this and see, even if in other states, if there are some creative local policies that I can send your way.
Oh, yeah,
because
great.
I don't have any examples other than budgetary off the top of my head. And if Montana Women Vote staff have other thoughts, please either share them off mute or pop them in the chat.
That's awesome. Thank you. And I'll put my email in the chat too, just so it's easy.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Other questions or ideas for policy discussion? Anybody on the Facebook live stream want to put anything in the comments that someone could relay back to me, possibly? Well, while you're thinking, I did sort of want to close with a little bit of a note and a story to share from some experience that Montana Women Vote has had. So one of the campaigns that Montana Women Vote took on in 2020 was working in Helena to provide some funding for local crisis response that would come from the local police budget and would result from a lack of rehiring of a couple of police positions that were retiring, and would mean that school resource officers would be taken out of public schools. There's a lot of data showing that the outcomes of having cops in schools is bad for low-income kids, students of color, queer students, etc. So it was a really new campaign for us, and it was super local. And it was really hard. And one of the things that we learned is that you don't always pass the policy that you want to pass. We did not succeed in making this budgetary allocation along with our allies at the city council. But I think that there's definitely something to be said for continuing to work hard, to think creatively about some of these major issues that we're seeing in our society and how we might be able to confront them at our local level, and how we might be able to start some of these really difficult conversations in our neighborhoods, in our communities, in our cities, in our coffee shops, at the bar, when you're not too drunk, so that if you get in an argument, it doesn't turn problematic in any way. But it was a very difficult campaign, but that conversation has been started, and people in that community are starting to think about whether or not these sorts of issues are, how strongly they feel about certain things, and what are the roles of these certain elected officials and certain people with power in our community to be certain places. So I just want to leave you all with an encouragement to think very creatively about how to address big concerns at the hyper-local level, because we have a lot of flexibility and a lot of freedom to talk with people one-on-one and to get to know other people in our communities and work together to make these positive changes. And there's not a lot of people who are paying attention to this stuff. So the fewer people that you have to deal with when you're organizing campaigns, the lower what's called your win number is, which means the fewer people you have to convince. So I am super passionate about local change. I hope you are all as well after hearing a little bit about all of this stuff today. And now I just want to encourage you to please complete our evaluation. We are so grateful for all of you who have attended WPLI so far. We have some awesome sessions coming up for you in the future. And if you fill out our evaluation of today's session, you will also be entered to win a copy of What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat by our keynote speaker, Aubrey Gordon, who was so amazing and inspiring on Thursday, and whose keynote speech is up on our YouTube channel. So I believe one of my illustrious colleagues will be popping that link to the evaluation in the chat. And then I also wanted to share my slides from this presentation. I think that everyone should get more passionate about getting involved in your local community, and I hope that you encourage and bother and pick at everyone else who you know in your city to get involved with you on something locally, because it's so important and you really can make a change, and it feels so amazing to actually pass a policy and get it done and see how it can change people's lives in your city every day. So go build a sidewalk, or pass a non-discrimination ordinance, or do something amazing. And tomorrow's session is going to be, one moment, I wasn't prepared for this.
Criminal legal reform.
Oh, thank you. Rethinking criminal justice in Montana. And am I correct that that is at 5:30 p.m.?
Yes.
Awesome. Check your email for all the links, and thanks everyone for joining us.
Thanks all.